The sun over the Arizona Territory in 1892 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, forging the red earth into a cracked and thirsty anvil. Here, in the border town of Canyon Daly, dust was the first and last currency. It settled on every hat brim, coated every throat, and rose in fine, choking clouds with every footstep. The wind, its constant accomplice, whispered dry secrets through the canyons, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the grit of ages. This was a land of sharp edges and stark beauty, a place where monoliths of sandstone clawed at an endless blue sky, and life clung to the dirt with a stubborn, thorny persistence. Catherine Harlow felt the grit between her teeth. She had been in Canyon Daly for 3 days, and already the place felt like it was trying to scour her down to the bone. She had come from Texas, a place she now thought of only in hushed, jagged pieces. She had left a name there, a life, and the ghost of a man whose memory was a brand on her soul. Here, she was just a woman, alone, with a few dollars folded in her bodice and a hope so thin she was afraid the wind might tear it away. She was seeking work at the trading post, a low-slung adobe building that seemed to be the town's very heart, where buckskin and silver were traded for flour and bullets, and where the paths of white men and the Navajo people crossed in a tense, wary dance. Each morning, she walked from the small room she rented to the trading post, and each morning, the proprietor, a man with a face like a dried apple, shook his head. He had no work for a woman like her, he said, his eyes lingering on her worn dress and the absence of a husband at her side. A woman alone was a question, and Canyon Daly did not care for questions it could not answer with a gun or a bottle. She was walking past the saloon, its bat-wing doors breathing a stale gust of whiskey and regret into the street. When the trouble found her, it always found her. It was as if the past she fled sent hounds ahead to wait for her at every crossroads. A group of men spilled out of the saloon, their laughter loud and brittle. They were cattle hands, by the look of them, their faces burned by the sun and their manners eroded by loneliness and cheap liquor. One of them, a big man with a stained duster and a cruel set of eyes, blocked her path. He looked her up and down, a slow, insolent appraisal that made her skin crawl. He spoke to his friends, but his voice was loud enough for the whole street to hear. He wondered aloud what kind of woman traveled so far on her own. He suggested she was not looking for work at a trading post, but for a different kind of trade altogether. Catherine tried to step around him, her face a pale, still mask. She would not give them the satisfaction of her fear. She had learned that from her late husband. Never show them the wound. They will only pour salt in it. But the big man moved again, blocking her way. His friends formed a loose circle, their faces a mixture of amusement and contempt. The town was watching. From the doorways of the general store and the blacksmith's shop, faces appeared, lingered, and then turned away. No one moved to help. They were shadows, silent and complicit. The big man reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was like iron. Catherine flinched. A small, involuntary movement. He smiled, a flash of yellowed teeth. He told her she was too pretty to be so proud. He said a little dust would not hurt her. Then, with a sudden, violent shove, he sent her sprawling into the street. She landed hard on her hands and knees. The impact jarred her teeth, and the sharp gravel of the street bit into her palms. The world tilted, a dizzying swirl of red dust and leering faces. The dust storm that had been threatening all afternoon began to whip through the street in earnest, a stinging curtain of sand that blurred the edges of the town. She could hear their laughter, thin and sharp on the rising wind. She remained on the ground, the humiliation a hot, bitter flood in her chest. It was not the fall that hurt. It was the silence, the vast, echoing silence of the people who watched and did nothing. It was the same silence she had known in Texas. Then, through the haze of dust and shame, a sound pierced the quiet. It was a small sound, a soft scuffing of moccasins on the hard-packed earth. A figure emerged from the periphery. It was a child, a little girl no older than 6 or 7. She was Navajo, her dark hair tied back with a simple leather thong, her small face serious and her black eyes wide with a gravity that seemed too old for her years. She moved with a purpose that belied her size, stepping carefully around the stones in the street until she stood just a few feet from Catherine. The men's laughter faltered, dying in their throats. The little girl looked at the men, her gaze unflinching. Then she turned to Catherine, still kneeling in the dust. She took a small, hesitant step closer. She was trembling, just a little, a tremor that ran through her small frame. But her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, a silver thread in the coarse fabric of the afternoon. She spoke in careful English. "My father will keep you safe." The words hung in the air, impossibly loud in the sudden stillness. They were a promise, a declaration, a single, unwavering note of kindness in a symphony of cruelty. The wind howled, but for a moment it seemed to hold its breath. The circle of men shifted, their bravado cracked. They looked from the child to the silent figures in the doorways. Suddenly uncertain, a new presence made itself known. He had been there all along, leaning against the shaded wall of the trading post, a tall figure wrapped in a worn wool blanket. He moved now, stepping out of the shadows with a fluid, unhurried grace that was more intimidating than any sudden threat. He was Navajo, his face a mask of carved plains and shadows, his long hair bound at the nape of his neck, his eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. He was Thomas Blackwater. He did not look at the men who had tormented Catherine. His gaze was fixed on the small girl, his daughter. He said nothing, but a silent communication passed between them. The girl, Nijoni, took a step back and stood beside him, her small hand finding his. Thomas Blackwater then turned his attention to the men. He still said nothing. He simply looked at them, his expression unreadable, his stillness a force more powerful than their blustering noise. One by one, they wilted under his gaze. The big man in the duster muttered something under his breath, a curse lost to the wind, and shuffled back towards the saloon. His friends followed, their swagger gone, melting back into the shadows from which they had come. The audience in the doorways disappeared. The street was empty again, save for the 3 of them and the rising storm. Thomas walked to where Catherine was still on the ground. He knelt, not beside her, but a respectful distance away. He held out a hand. It was a strong hand, calloused and capable. She looked at it for a long moment, then at his face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was something else, something deeper, an understanding, perhaps, a shared knowledge of the world's casual cruelty. She hesitated, then placed her trembling, dirt-stained hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and steady, and he helped her to her feet. She swayed, her legs unsteady, and he kept his hand on her arm to support her. The wind was a physical force now, tearing at her clothes and filling the air with a blinding, stinging sand. The sky had turned a bruised, angry yellow. He spoke, his voice low and calm against the shriek of the wind. "The storm is here. You cannot stay in the town." Catherine could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He released her arm and gestured for her to follow. With Nijoni walking close by his side, Thomas Blackwater turned his back on Canyon Dieli and began to walk towards the mesas that loomed like sleeping giants on the horizon. Catherine, with one last look at the town that had offered her nothing but scorn, pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and followed him into the heart of the growing storm. The desert was a place of trials, she knew, but as she walked behind the silent man and his brave little girl, a flicker of something she had thought long dead stirred within her. In this vast and unforgiving land, a single, whispered promise from a child had been the only hand to reach for her in the dark. It was a strange and fragile beginning, a seed of compassion planted in the most barren ground imaginable. The walk was a battle. The wind tore at them, a relentless assault of sand that scoured their skin and made every breath a conscious effort. Catherine lowered her head, pulling her shawl over her face and focusing on the faded blue of Thomas's blanket in front of her. He moved with an economy of motion, his body leaning into the gale, a solid, unwavering presence. The little girl, Nijoni, held fast to his hand, her small legs pumping to keep up, her trust in him absolute. They left the last of the town's ramshackle buildings behind, the sounds of civilization swallowed by the storm's roar. The landscape became a swirling chaos of red and brown. Catherine lost all sense of direction, all sense of time. There was only the wind, the sand, and the two figures leading her into the unknown. She did not know who this man was, or where he was taking her. She knew only that he was the father of the child who had spoken for her. In that moment, it was enough. Just when she thought her strength would fail her, that she would simply sink to her knees and let the desert claim her. Thomas stopped. He had led them into a narrow cut between two towering walls of sandstone. Here, the full fury of the wind was blunted, its howl reduced to a mournful whistle. Tucked into an alcove in the rock was a hogan, a traditional Navajo dwelling made of earth and logs. Its circular shape seemed both ancient and eternal, a part of the landscape itself. A thin tendril of smoke curled from the opening in its roof, a fragile sign of life against the storm's rage. Thomas pulled back the heavy blanket that served as a door and held it open for her. He gestured for her to enter. Catherine hesitated for only a second before ducking inside, desperate for shelter. Nijoni followed close behind her. Thomas entered last, letting the blanket fall back into place, sealing them off from the elemental chaos outside. The sudden silence was as profound as the storm's noise had been. The interior of the hogan was a single, round room, larger than it had appeared from the outside. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke, roasted juniper, and something else, something clean and vaguely medicinal. A small fire burned in a shallow pit in the center of the floor, its light casting a gentle, flickering glow on the packed earth walls. Sheepskins and woven blankets were piled neatly against one wall, offering warmth and comfort. It was a space of profound simplicity and peace. Nijoni went immediately to the fire, warming her small hands. Thomas moved to a corner, retrieving a clay pot and a ladle. He filled a cup with water and brought it to Catherine. She took it with hands that still shook, the raw scrapes on her palms stinging. She drank the water, cool and clean, and it felt like a blessing. She looked at him, trying to find the words to thank him, but her voice was a dry rasp. Her ordeal in the street, the fight against the storm, it had all stripped her bare. He seemed to understand. He took the empty cup from her and spoke, his voice as quiet as it had been in the street. "Rest now. You are safe from the storm." He pointed to a pile of sheepskins. Catherine sank down onto them, the soft wool a luxury against her aching body. She watched as he spoke quietly to his daughter in their own language, his tone gentle. Nijoni answered, her eyes darting towards Catherine for a moment before she went to a small loom in the corner and began to work the threads with practiced fingers. Lying there, cocooned in the warmth of the hogan, listening to the muffled scream of the wind outside, Catherine felt the tightly wound knot of fear and tension inside her begin to loosen. She was a stranger here, a white woman in a Navajo home, taken in by a man she did not know, by all the rules of the world she had come from. She should have been terrified. But as she watched the quiet warrior and his daughter move about their home, a sense of peace she had not felt in years settled over her. She thought of the little girl's words, a promise whispered in the dust. "My father will keep you safe, for the first time since leaving Texas." Catherine allowed herself to believe it might be true. She closed her eyes, the image of a small, brave face, her last waking thought as exhaustion finally pulled her under into a deep and dreamless sleep. Catherine awoke to a world remade. The roar of the storm had been replaced by a profound quiet, broken only by the soft crackle of a fire. For a moment, She did not know where she was. The air was thick with the unfamiliar, yet soothing scent of burning sage and piñon wood. She was lying on a soft pile of sheepskins, a rough woven blanket covering her. She pushed herself up, her muscles aching in protest. The light was dim, filtering down from the smoke hole in the center of the conical roof. The walls were not wood or canvas, but a smooth, curved expanse of packed earth, warm and solid. It felt like waking in the heart of the land itself, in the gentle light of the central fire. Thomas Blackwater sat mending a piece of leather harness, his long fingers working with a focused, unhurried precision. He did not seem to notice she was awake. His daughter, Nijoni, was on the other side of the fire pit, patting a small cake of cornmeal between her palms. She glanced at Catherine, her dark eyes wide and curious, before looking back to her father for direction. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, and the girl went back to her task. The scene was one of domestic tranquility, a quiet rhythm of life that felt a world away from the violence and noise of Canyon Delhi. Thomas saved her, yet he kept his distance. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. He was a man of immense silence, his presence a steady, grounding force in the small hogan. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet and deliberate. He would disappear for hours, returning with a rabbit for the pot or fresh herbs from the canyon floor. He spent time with his daughter, teaching her things in their soft, flowing language, his voice a low murmur. He worked, he hunted, he cared for his child. He provided Catherine with food, a share of the simple stew or the corn cakes that were their staple, and a place to sleep. But he offered nothing more. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was in simple, direct English, his words chosen for function, not conversation. He did not ask her where she had come from or why she was alone. His gaze would sometimes rest on her, his expression unreadable, before he would turn back to his tasks. The space between them was a vast, uncharted territory. A tide of conflicting emotions washed over Catherine. She was deeply, painfully grateful for the shelter, for the safety he and his daughter had given her. But it was a gratitude steeped in shame. She was a guest, a burden, an outsider living on the charity of a man whose people had been wronged time and again by her own. She watched him work, his body lean and strong, his hands never idle, and she felt her own uselessness like a heavy cloak. The humiliation she had suffered in the street was a fresh wound, and this passive acceptance of his charity felt like rubbing salt into it. She had come west to start anew, to be independent, not to be a helpless dependent. On the fourth morning, she could bear it no longer. The sun was just beginning to warm the red rocks of the canyon when she found him outside, sharpening the blade of an axe on a wet stone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was the only sound. She stood a few feet away, her hands clasped together, until he finally paused and looked up at her. His eyes were patient. "I cannot just sit here," she began, her voice a little unsteady. "I must repay you for your kindness. I can work, I can cook, I can mend clothes, I can clean. Please, let me do something to earn my keep." Thomas set the axe down carefully. He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were seeing right through to the fractured pieces of her soul. He saw the desperation there, but he also saw the flicker of pride, the stubborn refusal to be broken. He rose to his feet, his height casting a long shadow in the morning light. "Anyone who lives here must do their part," he said. The words were not an offer of employment, but a simple statement of fact, the fundamental law of this harsh and beautiful land. He gave a slight nod toward a large, flat stone near the Hogan's entrance, where a pile of dried blue corn waited. "Nijoni will show you how to grind." It was an acceptance, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over Catherine. It was a start, a way to reclaim a small piece of her shattered self-respect. Meanwhile, back in Canyon Delhi, the saloon owner, Elias Buchanan, was nursing a bottle of whiskey and a simmering resentment. Buchanan was a man who saw the world in terms of profit and loss, power and weakness. He was large and fleshy, his face perpetually flushed, his eyes small and calculating. He had built his saloon and his influence on the thirsts and prejudices of the men who passed through the town. He had a cozy relationship with the local marshal, a man more interested in keeping the peace with Buchanan than in dispensing actual justice. And Buchanan harbored a deep-seated, venomous prejudice against the Navajo. He saw them as lazy, untrustworthy, and, most importantly, as an impediment, the land their treaty allowed them to use, the valleys and canyons where they grazed their sheep and lived their lives, was land Buchanan coveted. He dreamed of running thousands of head of cattle through those canyons, of finding silver in those hills. Thomas Blackwater's silent defiance in the street had been a public rebuke, a challenge to Buchanan's authority in a town where his word was usually law. That a woman he had marked as insignificant had found sanctuary with one of the very people he despised was an intolerable insult. He sat at his own bar, pouring a drink for Marshal Thompson, a man with a tin star and a weak will. "It is a bad business," Elias, the marshal, said, wiping his mustache. "That Blackwater fellow stirring up trouble." He was not the one stirring it, Buchanan countered, his voice a low growl. It was that woman, a drifter. Comes here with no husband, no family. The decent folk of this town know what that means. And now she runs off with him, living in his hogan. It is an offense to God and to every white man in this territory. He let the words hang in the air, thick and poisonous. He was planting a seed, watering it with whiskey and hate. In the days that followed, he cultivated it carefully. He spoke to the cattle hands, the prospectors, the merchants. He painted Catherine as a woman of loose morals, a disgrace to her race. He twisted the story of her humiliation into one of her own making, suggesting she had invited the attention, that she had gotten what she deserved, and he tied her disgrace to the Navajo, using her as proof of their corrupting influence. Another reason to despise and distrust them. Catherine was oblivious to the storm of words brewing in town. Her world had shrunk to the hogan, the small spring where she fetched water, and the rhythmic, back-aching work of grinding corn. She learned to cook on the open fire, to patch the worn knees of Njoni's trousers, to understand the subtle language of the desert sky. A fragile sense of peace began to settle in her heart. She found a quiet joy in Njoni's shy smiles, and a growing respect for the silent man who was her father. But they could not remain isolated forever. Their supply of flour was running low, and Thomas needed to trade a few silver buttons he had crafted for coffee and salt. He announced one morning that he was going to the trading post. Catherine, seeing an opportunity to be useful, offered to go for him. She argued that the trader might be more willing to deal fairly with a white woman. Thomas considered this. He knew the trader was a hard man, and that his own presence often resulted in a poor exchange. After a long moment, he agreed. He gave her the small pouch of silver and a short list of supplies. As she walked the dusty track back toward Canyon Dealey, a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. The town no longer looked like a place of opportunity, but a den of threats. She kept her head down, her shawl pulled tight, hoping to be invisible. She made it to the trading post without incident, her transaction with the sour-faced proprietor swift and tense. It was as she was leaving, her small sack of supplies clutched in her hand, that a voice stopped her. "Well now, look what the cat dragged in." Catherine froze. She turned slowly. Elias Buchanan was standing on the boardwalk in front of his saloon, blocking her path. Two of his cronies flanked him, their expressions smug. "I heard you had found new accommodations," Buchanan said, his voice dripping with insinuation. "Getting friendly with the locals. Are we—" Catherine said nothing, her heart pounding against her ribs. She tried to step around him. He moved to block her again. "You should listen to me, girl," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Those people are not your kind. They are savages, godless heathens. A decent white woman has no business out there with them. You are making a mistake. A mistake that will cost you. This town has rules. You are better off remembering that." His eyes bored into her, cold and hard. It was not a suggestion. It was a threat. He was drawing a line in the sand, a line of race, of propriety, of power, and he was telling her she was on the wrong side of it. "You are a disgrace," he spat, his face contorting with contempt. "You go back out there, you stay with him, and you will find that this world has no place for you. You will be an outcast, and outcasts in this territory do not last long." He finally stepped aside, a smirk playing on his lips. Confident he had made his point, Catherine walked past him, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not run. She did not look back. She walked with a steady, determined pace, leaving the dusty, hateful street behind her. But his words followed her, clinging to her like burrs. She returned to the quiet sanctuary of the Hogan. The peace of the morning shattered. The small sack of flour and coffee felt impossibly heavy in her arms. Thomas was there, carving a piece of wood, while Najoni played nearby with a doll made of sticks and scraps of cloth. He looked up as she entered, his eyes questioning. She said nothing, simply put the supplies away, but he must have seen the shadow in her eyes, the tremor in her hands. That evening, as she sat by the fire, the weight of Buchanan's threat pressed down on her. He had called her a disgrace, an outcast. The words echoed the cruelest whispers of her own past. The world of Canyon Dieli, the world of white men and their rules, had judged her and cast her out. She looked across the fire at the silent Navajo man and his daughter. They had asked nothing of her, had not judged her. They had simply made a space for her. But staying here, in this small circle of warmth and quiet dignity, meant defying Elias Buchanan and everything he represented. It meant inviting a danger far greater than a few drunken cattle hands. Her fragile new life was caught between two warring worlds, and her own heart was the battleground. The ghosts of Texas did not stay buried. They rode the night winds across the plains and found Catherine even in the deep. Earthen safety of the Hogan. They came to her in dreams, smelling of gun smoke and cheap whiskey. In her sleep, she was back on a dusty street in a town she could no longer name, the sun a merciless white eye in the sky. Jacob was there, her husband. He was smiling, a thin, cruel slash of a smile that never reached his pale eyes. He had a pistol in his hand, and at his feet, a Navajo man lay bleeding into the dust. Jacob's laughter in the dream was the sound of breaking glass, and he would turn to her, that terrible smile widening, and say her name, Catherine Harlow, as if the name itself was a chain, binding her to him, to his violence, to his sins. She woke with a choked cry, her body slick with a cold sweat, the phantom smell of smoke still sharp in her nostrils. The Hogan was dark and silent. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing embers. Across the small space, she could just make out the two sleeping forms of Thomas and Najoni, wrapped in their blankets. Guilt, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. She was a fraud, a liar by omission, accepting the sanctuary of a people her own husband had murdered. The name Harlow was not just a name. It was a curse, stained with innocent blood. How could she live here, under the protection of a man whose people Jacob had hunted for sport? The weight of this secret became a physical burden, pressing down on her until she could hardly breathe. She watched Thomas with a new, painful awareness. She saw the old scars on his arms, the guarded stillness in his eyes, and wondered what griefs he carried in his deep silence. She imagined he looked at her with contempt, that he was only tolerating her presence for his daughter's sake. The peace she had begun to find frayed and unraveled, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. A few days after her nightmare, she followed him as he went to check his snares in the early morning light. The air was crisp and clean, the world washed in the soft pastels of dawn. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, his moccasins making no sound on the sandy soil. She finally found her voice, a thin, wavering thing in the vast stillness of the canyon. "You should know my name," she said, stopping a few paces behind him. "My full name. It is Catherine Harlow." Thomas paused, his back to her. He did not turn around. The name hung in the air between them. "I was married to Jacob Harlow," she forced herself to continue, the words like stones in her mouth. He still did not move. The silence stretched, amplified by the chirping of a canyon wren. She thought he might turn and order her to leave, to cast her out as she deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, devoid of any emotion she could decipher. "I know the name," he said. Of course he did. Jacob had been a gunman of some renown, his reputation as dark and ugly as a storm cloud. He had ridden with Pazes and cattle barons, a man who dealt in fear and violence. "Then you know what he was," she whispered, her shoulders slumping. "You know what he did. I have no right to be here. I am sorry." Thomas finally turned to face her. His expression was not one of hatred or anger, as she had expected. It was something far more complex, a deep, a sorrowful knowing. He looked at her, at the shame and self-loathing etched onto her face, and held her gaze for a long moment. "He was your husband. Thomas said he was not you." "But I was his wife," she cried, a raw edge to her voice. "I stood by. I did nothing. The sin is mine as well." He took a step closer, his presence solid and calming in the face of her turmoil. He looked past her, toward the east, where the sun was now cresting the mesa, setting the red rocks ablaze with light. "The dead belong to the earth," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Their deeds and their spirits are now part of the soil. The stone, the wind, the living must keep walking. If we carry the dead on our backs, we cannot move forward. We will sink into the ground with them." His words were simple, yet they struck her with the force of a revelation. He was not absolving her, nor was he condemning her. He was offering her a path, a way to live. He was telling her that her husband's past did not have to be her future. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope that she could, perhaps, unchain herself from the ghost of Jacob Harlow. That conversation, brief as it was, changed something between them. A barrier had been broken. Thomas remained a man of few words, but his silence now felt different. It was less a wall and more a quiet space, one she was slowly being invited into. He began to include her more in their daily life. He showed her how to find water seeping from the rock faces, how to recognize the tracks of a coyote versus those of a stray dog. He taught her to ride. The horse was a shaggy, stubborn creature with a wise eye. At first, she was terrified, her body stiff and awkward on its bare back. But Thomas was a patient teacher. He taught her to feel the horse's rhythm, to move with it, to trust it. And as she learned to trust the horse, she began, slowly, to trust herself again. Nijoni, who had been watching her with a child's solemn curiosity, began to treat her with a shy affection. She would bring Catherine a pretty stone she had found, or sit beside her and mimic her clumsy attempts to knead dough for bread. One afternoon, an older woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map arrived at the hogan. She was Desba, Thomas's aunt. She looked Catherine up and down with sharp, intelligent eyes, then gave a curt nod and began speaking to Thomas in Navajo. Catherine felt a familiar prickle of anxiety, of being judged. But Desba's purpose was not to cast her out. She returned the next day with a small, portable loom and a bundle of spun wool, dyed in rich shades of red and black and gold, with Nijoni acting as a giggling, imprecise translator. Desba began to teach Catherine how to weave. Her hands, so used to the soft work of a townswoman, were clumsy and slow. The threads tangled, the pattern went awry. But Desba was as patient as her nephew. She would click her tongue, unravel the mistake, and guide Catherine's fingers back to the proper place. In the long, sun-drenched afternoons, sitting outside the hogan with Desba and other women who would sometimes visit, Catherine learned more than just the mechanics of the loom. She learned a new language, a language of community and shared work. The women would talk and laugh as they worked, their voices rising and falling. They spoke of their children, of the sheep, of the coming season. They included her in their circle, offering her roasted corn, sharing a joke she did not quite understand but could appreciate from their smiles. They did not ask about her past. They simply accepted her presence in the now. She was the white woman who lived in Thomas's hogan, the one who was learning to ride and weave, the one who was trying. It was enough. Her feelings for Thomas deepened and transformed. Gratitude became a profound respect. Respect warmed into a quiet, tentative affection. She watched him with his daughter, his gentle strength a stark contrast to the brutal masculinity she had known with Jacob. She saw the way his eyes would soften when Nijoni told him a story, the way he would patiently explain the name of a plant or a star. He was a good man, a complete man, rooted in his world in a way she had never seen before. He was like the ancient sandstone mesas themselves, weathered and scarred, but solid, enduring, and possessed of a deep, quiet beauty. One night, the desert wind blew cold from the mountains. They sat close to the fire in the hogan, the only light coming from the flickering flames. Nijoni was already asleep, a small, still form under a pile of blankets. Thomas was working on a piece of buckskin, scraping it with a sharp piece of flint. The repetitive motion was hypnotic. Catherine watched the firelight play across the strong lines of his hands and arms. She saw it then, a long, jagged scar that ran across the back of his left hand, from the knuckle to the wrist. It was an old wound, silvery white against his brown skin. It spoke of a past filled with a violence he never mentioned. It was a mirror to the invisible scars that littered her own soul. Without thinking, without conscious thought, she reached out. Her fingers were trembling slightly as she gently traced the raised line of the scar. He went completely still. The scraping sound stopped. He did not pull his hand away. He simply stopped. His muscles tensed under her touch. She felt the warmth of his skin, the rough texture of the scar. It was a moment suspended in time, a silent conversation in the heart of the night. In that single, simple touch, she offered him her empathy, her acknowledgement of his own past pains, and in his stillness, in his acceptance of her touch, he let her in, just a little, past the silent walls he kept so carefully guarded. She drew her hand back slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Neither of them spoke. He picked up his tool and resumed his work, but the rhythm was different now. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. A week later, Catherine rode the horse to the spring by herself. She dismounted with a newfound confidence, filled the waterskins, and remounted without hesitation. On the ride back, she paused at a high point overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the vast desert landscape in strokes of fiery orange, deep purple, and soft rose. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distance. A year ago, this landscape would have terrified her. It would have seemed empty, desolate, a place of death. But now, she saw it differently. She saw the life that thrived in the harshest conditions. She saw the beauty in the stark, rugged lines of the land. She saw a place that had taken her in when she was broken and had, piece by piece, begun to put her back together. Elias Buchanan's threats still echoed in the back of her mind, a cold reminder of the world that had rejected her. But they seemed more distant now, their power diminished. She looked out at the endless expanse of rock and sand and sky, and, for the first time, she did not feel like she was hiding. She felt like she was home. The dead belonged to the earth. Thomas had said Jacob was in the earth, but she was here, under the vast Arizona sky, breathing, learning, feeling. Catherine Harlow looked at the desert, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally learning how to live again. Elias Buchanan's poison seeped into the cracked soil of Canyon Dieli and found fertile ground. He was a patient man when it came to nurturing a grudge. He no longer spoke of Catherine Harlow in vague terms. His whispers in the saloon became a direct and ugly accusation, a story crafted to inflame the worst instincts of the town. He painted her as a woman of the lowest sort, a runaway from a brothel in Texas, suggesting she had come to the territory to ply her trade among the Navajo because no decent white man would have her. The lie was simple, vicious, and effective. It gave the town's prejudice a face and a name. The change was palpable. When Catherine next went to the trading post, the proprietor refused to even look at her. He served the man behind her, then turned his back and began polishing glasses, leaving her standing there in a pocket of profound silence. Men on the street stopped talking when she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of scorn and crude curiosity. The boycott was not just for her. When Desba and another Navajo woman came to trade a finely woven blanket, they were offered a pittance, less than a quarter of its value, and told to take it or leave it. The air in Canyon Dieli grew thick with a simmering hostility, a line drawn not just in the dust, but in the hearts of its people. Catherine felt the isolation like a physical wall, but inside the hogan, a different world existed. The weaving, the writing, the quiet rhythm of life with Thomas and Najoni had become her reality. The town was a bad dream, a place she had to endure on rare occasions. Here, she felt her own worth, measured not by a man's name or a town's opinion, but by the work of her own hands. She was stronger, more capable than she had ever been. She did not know that her newfound strength was about to be tested by fire. It happened late one afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows from the sandstone pillars that guarded the canyon. A hot, dry wind was blowing, kicking up dust devils that danced across the valley floor. Thomas was inside the hogan with Najoni, showing her how to fletch an arrow with hawk feathers. Catherine was outside, taking down dried herbs that had been hanging from a wooden rack. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of shod horses, too many of them, coming too fast, then drunken laughter and crude shouts carried on the wind. Her blood ran cold. She straightened up, her eyes scanning the mouth of the canyon. A group of 5 riders appeared, their forms wavering in the heat haze. They were cowboys, slumped in their saddles, a bottle being passed between them. She recognized the big man from the first day, the one who had pushed her down. They were heading directly for the hogan. Her first instinct was a familiar, gut-wrenching fear. She wanted to run, to hide inside, to cower behind the flimsy blanket door. Then she thought of Najoni. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the quiet peace they had given her, this small circle of safety in a world that had offered her none. A different feeling rose up, hot and fierce, burning away the cold edges of her fear. It was anger, a deep, protective rage. This was her home they were coming to defile. She moved without thinking. She slipped inside the hogan, her movements urgent but silent. Thomas looked up, his head cocked, already aware of the approaching sound. His face was a calm, hard mask. He reached for the rifle that rested against the wall, but Catherine was closer. Her hand closed around the cool, smooth wood of the stock. It felt impossibly heavy. She had spent her life terrified of these objects, associating them only with Jacob's cold cruelty. But now, it felt different. It felt like the only choice she had. Thomas's eyes met hers. He saw the resolve in her face. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay with your father," he said to Najoni in their language, his voice low and steady. The little girl's eyes were wide, but she did not cry. She scrambled to his side. Catherine stepped back outside, the rifle held awkwardly in her hands. She stood in front of the doorway, planting her feet in the red dirt. She was a lone figure, a woman in a simple dress, holding a weapon that seemed too big for her. The riders were close now, pulling their horses to a chaotic halt a few yards away, kicking up a cloud of dust. "Well, looky here," the big man slurred, a nasty grin spreading across his face. "The little lost lamb, all by herself. We came to pay a social call." His companions laughed, their eyes roaming over her, Then to the hogan, their expressions a mix of malice and drunken bravado. One of them pulled a torch from his saddle roll, a bundle of oil-soaked rags on a stick. "We just want to clean the place up a bit," he said. "It is not right. A white woman living in a dirt hut like some animal." "Leave," Catherine said. Her voice was thin, but it did not tremble. "This is my home. You are not welcome here." The big man swung down from his horse, staggering slightly. He took a step toward her. "Oh, we are welcome. We are here to rescue you, take you back to civilization." He took another step. He was close enough now that she could smell the sour stench of whiskey on his breath. "Stay back," she warned, raising the rifle. The barrel shook in her grasp. "I will not say it again." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You going to shoot me, you little lady? You do not have the nerve." He lunged for her. In that split second, time slowed. The memory of Jacob's cold smile flashed in her mind, and then it was gone, replaced by the image of Najoni's trusting face. She was not Jacob's wife anymore. She was not a victim. She was a woman defending her home. She lifted the rifle, aimed it not at him but at the sky just over his head, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a massive crack that echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder. A brutal, shocking force. The big man froze. His lunge stopped in mid-stride, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. The horses shied and whinnied, their eyes rolling in panic. The other riders grabbed for their reins, their drunken confidence shattered by the sudden, violent noise. At that moment, Thomas stepped out of the hogan to stand beside her, his own rifle held with an easy, deadly familiarity. He did not say a word. He did not have to. His presence, combined with Catherine's shocking act of defiance, was enough. The spell was broken. The big man stared at Catherine, then at Thomas. His eyes wide, he slowly backed away, raising his hands. "No trouble," he muttered. "We were just leaving." He scrambled back onto his horse. Without another word, the 5 men turned their mounts and galloped away, their retreat as chaotic and undignified as their arrival had been. Catherine stood frozen, the heavy rifle still in her hands, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air. Her shoulder throbbed. Her ears were ringing. Her entire body was shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Thomas gently took the rifle from her hands. He looked down at her, and his eyes were different. The sympathy, the quiet pity he had sometimes shown her, was gone. In its place was something new, something deeper. It was respect, a profound, unwavering respect. He had seen her not as a woman who needed saving, but as a warrior who had stood her ground. That night, the silence in the hogan was different. It was not a silence of distance, but of shared experience. After Najoni was asleep, Thomas took the rifle and a small pouch of bullets and motioned for Catherine to follow him outside. The moon was a sliver of silver in a black sky littered with 1,000,000 stars. The air was cool and smelled of sage. He did not speak of the attack. He spoke of the rifle. "Your shoulder is bruised because you did not hold it correctly," he said, his voice a low murmur in the dark. "You must hold it tight. Make it a part of you." He handed the weapon back to her. "It is a tool. It can build a home, or it can tear one down. You must know how to use it." He stood behind her, his body close but not touching hers. He guided her hands, showing her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His instructions were simple, practical, his voice calm and steady in her ear. He showed her how to break the rifle open, how to slide a fresh cartridge into the chamber, the smooth, metallic click of the mechanism locking into place. "This is how you give it a voice," he said. The lesson was not just about survival. It was an act of profound trust. He was giving her power, the means to defend herself, to be his equal in the defense of their home. In the darkness, surrounded by the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the night wind, the last of the walls between them crumbled. He was not just her protector, and she was not just a refugee he had taken in. They were two people, standing together against a hostile world, bound by a shared danger and a fierce, unspoken loyalty. When the lesson was over, they sat on a smooth, flat rock, the rifle resting across their laps. They watched the stars, the silence comfortable and complete. Catherine felt the throbbing in her shoulder, a dull ache that was also a reminder of her own strength. She had faced down the ghosts of her past and the ugly threats of her present, and she had not broken. She looked at the man beside her, his profile a stoic silhouette against the starlight. He was no longer a mystery to her. She saw him not as a Navajo, not as a warrior, but as Thomas, a man of quiet courage, of deep integrity, a father who loved his child. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the faint moonlight, she saw the respect in his eyes mirrored back with an emotion she was finally brave enough to acknowledge in her own heart. They were not strangers anymore. They had never truly been strangers. The fragile peace born in the starlight was not destined to last. It was the desert's way. It gave moments of sublime stillness, but always held a new trial in reserve. The trial came not as a man with a gun, but as a fever in the night. It began subtly. Nijoni, normally a whirlwind of childish energy, became quiet and listless. She pushed her food away, and her cheeks held a feverish, unnatural flush. By evening, her skin was hot to the touch, and her dark eyes were glazed over with a sickness that frightened Catherine to her core. Thomas's stoic calm became a thin, brittle veneer over a father's deep and primal fear. He moved with a quiet urgency, bathing his daughter's forehead with cool, damp cloths. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark and other herbs Catherine did not recognize, coaxing the child to drink small sips. But the fever did not break. It grew, coiling inside the little girl's body like a serpent. By the second day, Nijoni was lost in a rambling delirium, her small hands picking at her blanket, her whispers a jumble of Navajo words and frightened whimpers. Catherine felt a wrenching helplessness. She did what she could, fetching water, keeping the fire low, speaking in soft, soothing tones to the child who no longer seemed to hear her. She watched Thomas, saw the exhaustion and fear carving new lines around his eyes. He had not slept. He sat by his daughter's side, a silent, unmoving guardian, his face a mask of stone that could not quite conceal the terror beneath. Late on the second night, as a storm began to gather in the distant mountains, Thomas looked at Catherine across the flickering firelight. His voice was a raw, strained whisper. "The fever is too strong. The herbs are not working. She needs Desba." Catherine knew the name. Desba was his aunt, the woman who had taught her to weave, the one they called a medicine woman, a healer. "Where is she?" Catherine asked, her own voice low and urgent. "She is with her sister, 2 canyons over, near the Spider Rocks. It is a half-day's ride in good weather." He looked at Nijoni, his expression torn with an agonizing indecision. He could not leave her. He could not risk being away from her side, even for an hour. But if he did not go for help, he might lose her forever. Catherine saw the conflict in his eyes. In that moment, a powerful clarity washed over her. She knew what she had to do. This was not about repaying a debt. It was not about earning her keep. This was about family. This small, feverish child had been the first person in this hard land to show her kindness. This silent, grieving man had given her a home. "Let me go," she said. The words were out before she had time to consider their full weight. "I can ride. You taught me. I can find the way. You draw me a map in the dirt." Thomas stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something she could not read. A white woman, riding alone into the wilderness, in a gathering storm. For a Navajo child, it was unthinkable. "The horse knows the way to the rocks," he said, more to himself than to her, his mind racing. He looked from Catherine's determined face to his daughter's flushed one. "Please," Catherine insisted, her voice soft but unyielding. "Let me do this. For her. For both of you." For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Najoni's shallow, rapid breathing. The decision was a terrible one, a choice between two impossible risks. He finally gave a single, sharp nod. His trust in her, in that moment, was a heavier weight than any rifle. He quickly sketched a map in the ashes near the fire pit, his finger tracing lines and marking landmarks. He made her repeat the directions, his voice clipped and precise. "Turn at the split juniper. Follow the wash until you see the 3 red pillars. Then climb the high trail." He brought the horse, already saddled, and tied a waterskin and a small pouch of dried meat to the horn. He looked at the sky, a bruised, ominous purple in the west. The air was heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness. "Ride fast," he said, his hand on the horse's bridle. "Do not stop." She mounted, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked down at him, at his upturned face, etched with worry. She wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but no words seemed adequate. She simply nodded, gathered the reins, and urged the horse into a canter, heading out of the canyon and into the approaching storm. The first part of the journey was a race against the dying light. The horse, as if sensing the urgency of their mission, stretched its legs, its hooves pounding a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Catherine focused on the landmarks from Thomas's map, her eyes scanning the alien landscape of rock and twisted trees. The air grew colder. The wind began to moan through the canyons. Then the sky tore open. The rain did not fall. It descended in a solid, blinding curtain of water. Lightning clawed at the horizon, followed a heartbeat later by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The horse whinnied, its ears flattened against its head in terror. Catherine held on, her knuckles white on the slick leather of the reins. Her dress soaked through in an instant. The trail dissolved into a muddy stream. She could barely see a few feet in front of her. She found the dry wash Thomas had described, but it was no longer dry. A shallow, muddy torrent was already coursing through it. This was the path. She had to follow it. She urged the horse into the water, its legs sinking into the soft, sucking mud. The water was rising. She could feel its pull getting stronger. She heard it before she saw it, a low rumble that grew into a deafening roar. She looked up the wash and saw a sight that froze the blood in her veins. A wall of brown, churning water, thick with debris, was sweeping down the narrow canyon toward her. A flash flood. The horse screamed, a sound of pure panic, and tried to scramble up the steep, muddy bank. It lost its footing, sliding back into the raging torrent. Catherine was thrown from the saddle. The shock of the icy water stole her breath. She was pulled under, tumbling end over end in the violent current, her head striking a submerged rock. The world became a chaotic nightmare of brown water and blackness. She fought her way to the surface, gasping for air, the roar of the flood filling her ears. She saw a small, gnarled root sticking out from the canyon wall and lunged for it, her fingers closing around the slick wood. The current tore at her, trying to rip her away, her body a flag in a liquid hurricane. Her strength was failing. Her grip was slipping. The darkness was closing in around the edges of her vision. She was going to die here, in this nameless canyon, a failed messenger. Her last thought was of Najoni's small, hot hand in hers. Then, a new shape appeared through the blinding rain. A dark figure, half hidden by the storm, moving with impossible speed along the canyon rim. He was running, leaping from rock to rock, a desperate, silent race against the flood. It was Thomas. He reached the spot just above her, his face a mask of fierce, terrifying resolve. He had a rope in his hand. He braced himself against a rock and threw it. The coil landing in the water just a few feet from her. She could not reach it. Her arm was leaden, her fingers numb. He shouted her name, his voice a raw cry that cut through the storm's roar. Catherine. He threw the rope again, This time, it slapped against her shoulder. With the last of her strength, she let go of the root with one hand and fumbled for the rope, her fingers closing around it just as another wave crashed over her head, pulling her under. She held on. It was her only anchor to the living world. She felt a powerful, steady pull. And then his strong hands were grabbing her, hauling her from the water's deadly embrace and onto the muddy bank. She lay there, coughing up water, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable shivers. He knelt over her, his hands on her shoulders, his own breath coming in ragged gasps. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his face. He pushed the wet hair back from her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. She looked up into his eyes and saw an emotion she had never seen there before. It was a raw, naked terror, a fear so profound it left no room for his usual stoic mask. He had followed her. He had not been able to let her go alone. He had trusted her, but his fear for her had been greater. He had saved her. They huddled together against the rock wall as the storm raged around them, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind and rain. When the floodwaters began to recede, he helped her to her feet and led her to where his own horse was tethered in a sheltered alcove. He lifted her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins, his body a solid wall of warmth against her back. He said nothing as he guided the horse back the way they had come. There was nothing to say. When they arrived back at the hogan, the blanket door was pushed aside. Desba was there, kneeling by the fire, grinding herbs with a stone pestle. She had seen the storm. She explained in a mixture of Navajo and English. She knew a child was sick. She had come on her own. Najoni was sleeping on her pallet, her breathing still shallow, but the frantic heat seemed to have lessened. Desba worked her remedies, and Catherine and Thomas could only watch and wait. Hours passed. The storm outside finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed world. Sometime before dawn, Najoni's fever broke, her skin grew cool, her breathing deepened into a natural, healing sleep. The crisis had passed. A wave of relief so immense it was physically painful washed through Catherine. She sagged against the wall of the hogan, her own exhaustion catching up with her. Desba gave a satisfied nod and settled in to watch over the child. Thomas came and sat beside Catherine. In the dim, pre-dawn light, he looked at her, his face worn with the trials of the night. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a streak of dried mud. "You dared to risk yourself for my daughter," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. Her own people would not have done that. No one has ever done that. His words were a quiet testament to the chasm she had crossed. She was no longer an outsider, a white woman living on his charity. She had risked everything for his child, for their family. He leaned in, his eyes holding hers. The air in the small hogan grew thick, charged with all the unspoken things that had passed between them over the long weeks. The respect, the gratitude, the shared danger, the quiet affection. It all coalesced in this one moment, in the stillness after the storm. He kissed her. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, as gentle and real as the rain that had washed the desert clean. It was trembling with the fear they had just endured and the profound relief of survival. It was a kiss of gratitude, of awe, of a connection forged in fire and flood. It was a promise. In that moment, she heard a faint echo of a small, brave voice in a dusty street. "My father will keep you safe." The prophecy had come full circle. He had kept her safe from the storm. But she, in her own way, had just done the same for him, risking her life to save the part of him that mattered most. The protection was no longer one-sided. It was a circle, complete and unbroken. They drew apart slowly, the promise sealed, the world outside quiet, the future an unknown territory they would now face together. The kiss after the storm was a silent promise, a seed of hope planted in the rain-softened earth. In the weeks that followed, it grew in the quiet spaces between them, in shared glances across the fire, In the easy way he would hand her a tool, in the way her hand would brush his as they worked. Nijoni was healthy again, her laughter a bright, clear sound that filled the small hogan and echoed in the canyon. For the first time, Catherine felt the tendrils of a fragile, joyful peace take root in her heart. She was no longer a refugee, a widow, an outcast. She was part of this small circle, a weaver of blankets and a mender of clothes, a woman who knew the weight of a rifle and the taste of a kiss born from survival. This quiet life was more than she had ever dared to dream of. But dreams in this land were often interrupted by the harsh light of day. The interruption came on a hot, still afternoon. They arrived without warning, 3 riders cresting the small rise that led to the hogan. Catherine's hand flew to her throat, her first thought of the cowboys returning. But the man in the lead wore a dusty hat and a tarnished silver star on his vest. It was Marshal Thompson. Flanking him were Elias Buchanan and one of his hired men, a lean, whey-faced deputy with cold, empty eyes. Buchanan's face was a mask of smug triumph. Thomas stepped out of the hogan, moving to stand in front of Catherine and Nijoni, who clung to her father's leg. He was unarmed, his posture calm, but a dangerous stillness settled over him. "Thomas Blackwater," the marshal said, his voice carrying an official, hollow weight. "I have a warrant for your arrest." On what charge? Thomas's voice was low and even. "Horse theft. 3 horses. Property of the United States Army. Went missing 2 nights ago. We have a witness who saw you leading them into the deep canyons." The lie was so blatant, so perfectly constructed to be unbreakable, that it stole the air from Catherine's lungs. It was a cage, and Buchanan had just slammed the door shut. "That is impossible," Catherine said, her voice sharp with outrage as she stepped forward from behind Thomas. "He was here. He has not left this canyon. His daughter was sick. She just recovered. I have been here the entire time. He never left." The marshal shifted uncomfortably, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Buchanan, however, laughed. A short, ugly bark. "And who are you to be his witness?" he sneered, his gaze sweeping over her with contempt. "A runaway trollop hiding out in a savage's mud hut. Your word is worth less than nothing here." "Step aside, ma'am," the deputy said, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. "This is official business." Catherine stood her ground. Her heart was pounding, but her voice was steady. "I will not. You are arresting an innocent man on the word of a liar." Buchanan's face darkened with fury. He started to dismount, but the marshal held up a hand. "That is enough. Elia, Thomas Blackwater, you will come with us. We can sort this out in town." Thomas looked at Catherine. In his eyes, she saw a silent command. He did not want her hurt. He did not want a fight here, not with Nijoni watching. With a slow, deliberate movement, he raised his hands, a sign of surrender. The whey-faced deputy dismounted, a pair of iron handcuffs dangling from his hand. He approached Thomas, a smirk on his thin lips. The click of the handcuffs locking around Thomas's wrists was the loudest sound Catherine had ever heard. It was the sound of injustice, of a good man being swallowed by a world of lies. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. It was happening all over again. The world was watching, and the world was doing nothing. But the world was not as empty as she thought. From the mouth of the canyon, a figure appeared. It was Desba, walking with a steady, unhurried pace, and behind her came another, and another, men and women. They emerged from the rocks and the trees, a silent, growing crowd. They were not armed for a fight. They carried weaving tools, hoes, the implements of their daily lives. But they moved with a single, unified purpose. They streamed into the clearing, their faces grim and determined, until they had formed a dense, silent circle around the lawman and their prisoner. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of brown skin and black hair, their eyes fixed on Thomas. The marshal's jaw dropped. He looked around wildly, his hand hovering over his gun. The deputy took a nervous step back. his smirk gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his pale face. Buchanan's face was a mottled purple of pure rage. "What is the meaning of this?" the marshal demanded, his voice cracking. "Disperse at once! This is the law!" Despa stepped forward. She looked not at the marshal, but at Thomas. She spoke, her voice clear and strong, not in English, but in the flowing, powerful cadences of the Dine language. Her words were a declaration, a claim. The others murmured in agreement, a low, rumbling sound that was more intimidating than any shout. The message was clear, crossing all barriers of language. "He is one of us. He does not go with you." Not go. Marshal Thompson was paralyzed with indecision. A weak man trapped between his fear of Buchanan and his fear of the silent, unmoving circle of people who now surrounded him. He was a man drowning in a situation far beyond his depth. Buchanan had no such hesitation. His authority was being challenged, his perfect trap being thwarted by the very people he despised, his face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. And he acted. He drew his pistol with a roar of fury. He did not aim at the handcuffed Thomas. He aimed at the man standing beside Despa and fired. The gunshot ripped through the tense stillness. The Navajo man cried out and staggered back, clutching a bloody shoulder. And with that single, violent act, chaos erupted. The world dissolved into a nightmare of smoke and noise. The Navajos scattered, not in retreat, but seeking cover, their peaceful tools now useless against bullets. The deputy drew his weapon and fired into the crowd. Thomas, seeing his chance in the confusion, drove his cuffed hands forward. A brutal two-fisted blow that sent the marshal stumbling backward. Catherine moved on pure instinct. She shoved Nijoni, who was screaming with terror, back into the safety of the hogan and grabbed the rifle from its place by the door. Everything Thomas had taught her, every lesson in the moonlit darkness, coalesced into a single, clear purpose. The deputy, recovering his balance, turned and took deliberate aim at the defenseless, handcuffed Thomas. There was no time to think. Catherine raised the rifle, the stock fitting snugly against the shoulder he had taught her to protect. She saw the deputy's back, the clean line of his spine. She saw Thomas vulnerable and exposed. She breathed out, just as he had shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her, a familiar, violent kick. The deputy screamed, a high, thin sound, and spun around, his pistol clattering to the ground. He collapsed, clutching his right shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. She had not killed him. She had saved Thomas. In the ensuing chaos, Despa's husband, a strong, wiry man, tackled the stunned marshal, wrestling his gun away. Thomas, using the raw power of his shoulders, broke the chain of the cheap handcuffs against a rock outcropping. He scooped up the deputy's fallen pistol and turned to face his accuser. The gunfight was over as quickly as it had begun. The hired cowboys who had been with Buchanan were gone, having fled at the first sign of real resistance. It was down to two men, Thomas and Elias Buchanan. Buchanan stood alone, his face pale with a mixture of fear and disbelief. He fumbled to reload his pistol. Thomas closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. He knocked the gun from Buchanan's hand and slammed him back against the wall of the hogan. The air went still. Everyone stopped, watching, as Thomas pressed the barrel of the pistol he held hard against Buchanan's sweating temple. This was the moment. Justice, vengeance, every insult, every threat, every lie, every drop of blood that had been spilled, it all came down to this. Catherine held her breath, her heart a wild, frantic bird in her chest. She saw the cold, righteous fury in Thomas's face, the trembling terror in Buchanan's, a single movement of his finger, and it would all be over. Buchanan whimpered, a pathetic, animal sound. "Please." Thomas's knuckles were white where he gripped the pistol. His whole body was rigid, a conduit of rage and grief. He looked into the eyes of the man who had tried to destroy him, to take him from his child, to poison his home. Then, something in his expression shifted. The hard lines of his face softened, not into forgiveness, but into a profound and weary sorrow. He looked past Buchanan, at the red rocks of the canyon, at his people gathered in the clearing, at the blood staining the earth. He slowly, deliberately lowered the gun. He let out a long, shuddering breath and stepped back, leaving Buchanan to slide down the wall of the hogan, a boneless, whimpering heap. "This land does not need more blood," Thomas said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent clearing. It was over, not with a final, satisfying crack of a pistol, but with a choice. Thomas had looked into the abyss of violence and had chosen to turn away. He had claimed a justice not of vengeance, but of dignity. He had proven his innocence not by killing his enemy, but by refusing to become him. The silence that followed Thomas's words was more profound than any gunshot. It was a silence of awe, of a choice so unexpected it seemed to rearrange the very air in the canyon. Elias Buchanan, a collapsed heap of a man, stared up at Thomas with the eyes of a cornered animal that had been shown an inexplicable mercy. Marshall Thompson, his face pale and slack, looked from the lowered gun to the silent circle of Navajo people, and in that moment, he understood that his authority, the flimsy authority of a tin star and a piece of paper, meant nothing here. The law of this land was older and deeper, with clumsy, shamed movements. The marshal helped his wounded deputy to his feet. The deputy, his face twisted in pain, glared at Catherine with pure hatred. But it was the impotent hatred of a defeated man. The Navajo people parted, creating a narrow path for them to leave. No one spoke. No one moved to stop them. Their victory was in their stillness, in their refusal to be provoked into the same kind of senseless violence that had been brought to their home. The marshal retrieved Buchanan. Pulling him up from the dirt, Buchanan stumbled away, not even bothering to pick up the pistol that lay in the dust. He did not look back. His swagger was gone, his power broken. He was just a man, leaving a place where his hate had found its limit. He would leave Canyon Dieli before the sun set, a disgraced figure running from the consequences of his own venom. Marshall Thompson mounted his horse, a man diminished. He looked at Thomas, who stood watching him, his expression unreadable. The lawman opened his mouth as if to say something, a threat, a justification, but the words died in his throat. He simply nodded, a curt, defeated gesture. It was a retreat, but it was also a concession, an unspoken acknowledgement that this small patch of earth, this canyon and the people who lived in it, were beyond his reach. He and his deputy rode away, leaving the scent of gun smoke and failure to dissipate on the dry afternoon air. When they were gone, the stillness broke. Desba came to Thomas, her hands checking him for injuries, her voice a low, rapid stream of concerned Navajo. The man who had been shot was being tended to by his family, the wound painful but not fatal. Nijoni, released from the hogan, ran to her father, her small arms wrapping around his legs, her face buried in his buckskin trousers. Thomas lifted her, holding her close, his eyes closing for a long moment as he breathed in the scent of her hair. He was safe. His daughter was safe. Catherine stood apart, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. The scene before her, this quiet coming together of a community, was beautiful and powerful, and she felt like an observer, a ghost at the edge of it. Her own actions felt unreal. The memory of the rifle kicking against her shoulder, the deputy's cry, the fall of a man because of her hand. It all churned inside her. She had saved Thomas, but she had done it with the very tool of violence she had always despised. Thomas saw her, over the top of Nijoni's head. His eyes found hers. He said something to Desba, who took the child from his arms. Then he walked toward Catherine. He gently took the rifle from her grasp and leaned it against the hogan wall. He looked at her hands, which were trembling uncontrollably. He took them in his own, his grip firm and steady, stilling their frantic motion. He said nothing, but his eyes told her everything. He saw her shock, her fear, and his gaze was filled with a gratitude so profound it made her throat ache. Later, inside the hogan, the world shrank to the two of them. The others had dispersed, taking the wounded man to be cared for, leaving the small family to its own quiet healing. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache. Catherine noticed it then, the long, ragged gash on his forearm, a bloody tear in his sleeve where the broken chain of the handcuff had sliced into his flesh as he fought for his freedom. Without a word, she went to fetch a bowl of clean water and strips of linen. He sat on a pile of sheepskins, watching her as she moved. The light inside the hogan was soft, the late afternoon sun filtering through the smoke hole, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a peaceful, domestic scene that stood in stark, surreal contrast to the violence that had just unfolded. She knelt before him and gently pushed up his sleeve. The cut was deep, lined with dirt and dried blood. Her touch was hesitant at first, then grew steady as she began to clean the wound. Her fingers, stained with dye from her weaving, were deft and careful as they washed away the grime, her movements focused and tender. He was perfectly still, his arm resting in her hands. He watched her face, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentle set of her mouth. The silence was thick with unspoken words, the chaos of the gunfight, her fear for him, his act of mercy, her act of violence. It all lay between them. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "When I saw that man aim his gun at you, I did not even think." He reached out his uninjured hand and placed it over hers, pausing her work. "You were brave," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You have the heart of a warrior." "I am not a warrior," she said, shaking her head. "I hate guns. I hate what they do." He looked at the rifle, still leaning against the wall. A tool. He repeated the words he had spoken to her on that moonlit night. "You used it to protect our home, to protect my daughter. There is no hate in that. There is only love." His use of the word "our" resonated deep within her. Our home. She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap it tightly with a clean strip of linen. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. When she was done, her hands lingered on his arm for a moment longer than necessary. The shared intimacy of the act, the quiet care in the aftermath of terror, was more profound than any kiss. They sat for a long time in a comfortable silence, until the light inside the hogan began to fade from gold to a soft, dusky rose. Thomas rose and went to the entrance. Pulling back the blanket to look outside, the sun was beginning its final descent, a great fiery orb balancing on the edge of the western mesas. The sky was a magnificent, impossible canvas of orange, red, and violet. "Come," he said softly. She went and stood beside him in the doorway. The air was cool and clean, the scent of the rain-washed desert rising from the earth. The world was quiet, at peace with itself. They stood side by side, not touching, and watched the day die in a blaze of glory. The beauty of it was so intense, so pure. It felt like a form of grace, a blessing after the day's bloody trial. Catherine thought of the town, of the life she had fled, of the people who saw her as a disgrace. Then she looked at the man beside her, at this wild, beautiful land that had somehow become her sanctuary. Everything in her life had led her to this single, peaceful moment. The question that had been hovering in the deepest part of her heart for weeks finally rose to her lips, a whispered, vulnerable breath. "Do you think I belong here?" She was not just asking about the canyon, about the hogan. She was asking about his world, his people, his life. She was asking if a broken woman from a different world could ever truly find a place beside him. Thomas did not answer right away. He continued to watch the last sliver of the sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the sky to the softer light of evening. He turned to her, his face illuminated in the twilight glow. His expression was serious, his eyes deep and searching. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. He finally spoke, his voice as quiet and vast as the desert sky. "You belong where someone dares to love you, even if the whole world objects." The words were more than an answer. They were a declaration, a promise. He was not just offering her a place in his home. He was offering her a place in his heart. He was telling her that belonging was not about the color of one's skin or the customs of one's people. It was about having the courage to love and the courage to be loved, in defiance of all the ugly lines the world tried to draw between them. A tear she did not know she was holding escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or fear, but of a relief so profound it felt like a homecoming. She did not wipe it away. He had given her the only answer that had ever mattered. She belonged with him. The declaration hung in the twilight air between them, a truth more solid than the red rock of the canyon. It was not a question that required an answer, but a foundation upon which a new life could be built. In the days that followed, the unspoken promise of those words began to take physical shape. The Hogan had been a sanctuary, a temporary shelter from the storm of the world. But a home was something different. A home was a place to put down roots, a place to build for a future. It was Thomas who chose the spot. A short walk from the sheltered alcove of the Hogan, nestled in a gentle curve of the canyon, was a small, flat meadow through which a narrow, year-round stream trickled. A single, ancient cottonwood tree stood sentinel beside the water, its leaves rustling with a sound like a gentle rain. It was a place of life, of water and shade, in a land of sun and stone. "Here," he said one morning, his hand gesturing to the open space, "we will build." The building of the house was not a solitary act. It was a testament to their new place in the community. On the day Thomas began felling the first of the slender pine and juniper trees from a high mesa, Desba's husband and 2 other men arrived, their axes on their shoulders. There was no formal request for help. They simply came. They saw a member of their community building a life, and they came to lend their strength. Catherine watched them work. A silent symphony of shared effort. The clean, sharp scent of cut wood filled the air, mingling with the smell of dust and sweat, the rhythmic thud of axes, the scrape of a draw knife peeling bark, the low murmur of voices in Navajo. It was the music of creation. She was not left to be a mere observer. While the men worked on the heavy logs, Desba and the other women showed her how to mix the chinking, a thick plaster of clay, water, and fine grass. She plunged her hands into the cool, wet earth, the feeling of the mud squeezing between her fingers a strange and deeply satisfying sensation. It was as if she were molding the very land itself into a home. Day by day, the structure rose. A small, sturdy cabin with a solid roof and a stone fireplace, its back to the canyon wall, its single window facing the sunrise. It was not a large house, but it was theirs, built not just of wood and mud, but of community and shared hope. As the walls of the house went up, so too did the invisible walls of Catherine's new life. She had learned to survive in this land, now she was learning to truly live in it. Desba, seeing Catherine's interest in the small garden she kept, took her on as a student. She taught her the wisdom of the 3 sisters, how to plant corn in small mounds, with climbing beans using the stalks for support, and broad-leafed squash growing below to keep the soil moist and weed-free. Catherine knelt in the dirt, her hands, once soft and pale, now brown and calloused, and felt a connection to the earth she had never known. She was not just taking from the land, she was nurturing it, participating in its ancient cycle of death and rebirth. Her own past, the world she had come from, found a new purpose here as well. One afternoon, Najoni found an old, dog-eared book of poetry Catherine had managed to keep, one of the few relics of her former life. The child traced the strange black marks on the page with a curious finger. "What do they say?" she asked. And so, Catherine began to teach. At first, it was just for Najoni, sitting in the shade of the cottonwood tree, Catherine patiently forming the letters of the alphabet in the sand. But soon, other children, drawn by curiosity, came to watch. Before long, she had a small, informal school. 5 or 6 children would gather each afternoon, their bright, intelligent faces turned up to hers. She taught them their letters, how to write their names, how to sound out the simple words in her book. It was a barter of knowledge. In return, they taught her. They would point to a bird and give her its Navajo name. They would show her which berries were sweet and which were poison. They would laugh at her clumsy pronunciation and repeat the words until she got them right. In teaching, she found she was also a student, weaving her own knowledge into the rich fabric of their world. The day Nijoni first called her mother, it happened so naturally that it almost passed unnoticed. Catherine was brushing the tangles out of the little girl's long, black hair, a nightly ritual that had become one of her favorite parts of the day. They were talking about the shapes of clouds, and Nijoni, pointing a small finger toward the sky, said, "Look, Mother, that one looks like a running sheep." The comb in Catherine's hand stilled. The word, spoken with such simple, unthinking acceptance, landed in her heart with the force of a physical blow. It was a word she had never expected to hear directed at her. It was a word that healed a wound so old and deep she had forgotten it was there. She could not speak. She simply hugged the child close, her face buried in the clean scent of her hair, as tears of a joy so pure it was almost painful streamed down her cheeks. Thomas was nearby, mending a piece of tack. He saw the exchange, saw the tears on Catherine's face, and a slow, gentle smile touched his lips. His family was whole. The community's acceptance, once a quiet and gradual thing, became complete. The woman who had been saved by the warrior was now a part of their daily lives. She was the one who helped the women with their weaving. Her own patterns still simple, but her hands now quick and sure. She was the one who tended the sick with desba, her knowledge of some white medicines a useful addition to the healer's ancient craft. She was the one the children ran to with a scraped knee or a story to tell. They no longer saw her as the white woman, the outsider. They saw her as Catherine, the woman who belonged with Thomas. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done and Nijoni was asleep in the nearly finished cabin, Catherine would often see Thomas take a piece of cottonwood root and a small, sharp knife and begin to carve. He would work for hours by the firelight, his movements precise and focused, the wood shavings falling like soft snow onto the ground. She never asked what he was making. It was a private, meditative act, and she respected his silence. One night, as a full moon bathed the canyon in a soft, ethereal light, he finished. He had been polishing the carving with a smooth river stone, and now he held it out to her. She took it, her hand cupping the small object. It was a turtle, its shell carved with intricate, geometric patterns, its small, wise head extended as if in motion. The wood was smooth and warm to the touch, and he had drilled a small hole through the top, threading it with a thin leather cord. "In our stories," he said, his voice a low murmur, "the turtle carries the world on its back. It is a symbol of protection, of endurance. It is the earth itself." He took it from her and gently placed the cord around her neck. The wooden turtle came to rest in the hollow of her throat, a small, solid weight against her skin. It was more than a gift. It was a blessing, a promise of his protection, an acknowledgement of her own endurance. She lifted her hand to touch it, her fingers tracing the patterns he had so patiently carved. The house was finished as the first chill of autumn began to creep into the night air. To celebrate, they held a gathering. It was not a wild party like the ones she had known in Texas, but a quiet, communal feast. A fire was built in the stone ring outside the new cabin, and the families came, bringing roasted mutton, corn, and squash. They ate and talked, their voices a low, happy murmur under the vast, star-filled sky. After the meal, one of the older men brought out a drum. He began to play, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to rise from the very earth, the heartbeat of the canyon. The sound was ancient and powerful, and it settled deep in Catherine's bones. Thomas rose and came to her where she sat on a log, Nijoni asleep with her head in Catherine's lap. He held out his hand. She took it, and he gently lifted her to her feet. Taking the sleeping child from her and passing her to a waiting Desba, he led Catherine to the center of the gathering, into the circle of firelight. The drumbeat grew stronger. The faces around the fire were lit by the flickering flames, their expressions warm and expectant. Thomas turned to face her. He did not have a ring. He did not have the pretty, hollow words of a white man's proposal. He had only the truth, spoken plainly and honestly in the heart of his community. "Catherine Harlow," he said, his voice clear and steady above the rhythm of the drum, "you are the mother of my child. You are the heart of my home. My life is here, with you. Will you be my wife?" The world seemed to stop. There was only the firelight, the beat of the drum, and the face of the man who had shown her the meaning of love and belonging. Her answer was not just for him, but for all the people who had become her family. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, certain joy. "Yes, I will." The drumbeat swelled, a powerful, triumphant affirmation. Desba and the other women began to sing, a high, ululating chant of celebration. Catherine looked at Thomas, and in his smiling eyes, she saw her future, as solid and enduring as the stone of the canyon, as bright and hopeful as the fire that danced before them. She was home. The season turned, and the fierce baking heat of summer gave way to the crisp, clear days and cold nights of autumn. The small cabin by the stream was a haven of warmth and light. The scent of curing herbs and wood smoke clung to the new pine logs, a fragrance Catherine had come to associate with peace, with a life rebuilt from the ashes of another. Their days settled into a comfortable rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons. There was the work of the garden, the weaving on the loom, the quiet afternoons teaching the children, the shared meals, the soft murmur of their voices in the evenings as Nijoni slept soundly in her small bed. The love between Catherine and Thomas was like the stream that ran beside their home, a quiet, steady current that ran deep, nourishing everything around it. For Catherine, the quiet happiness was so complete, so profound, that it was sometimes frightening. She would find herself holding her breath, listening for the other shoe to drop, for the ghosts of her past to come clawing their way into her present. But the days passed into weeks, and the only sounds were the wind in the cottonwood leaves and the laughter of a child. She began to believe that she was finally, truly safe. The darkness, when it returned, did not send a warning. It came on a day that began like any other. But by midday, the sky had taken on a strange, bruised yellow hue. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an oppressive, electric silence. The birds stopped singing. Thomas came in from checking his snares, his face grim, his eyes scanning the unnatural sky. "A bad one is coming," he said, his voice low. "A dust storm." He began securing the cabin, shuttering the single window, placing a heavy stone against the door. Catherine gathered Nijoni inside, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud of unease. The wind began to rise, not as a gentle breeze, but as a low, mournful moan that grew steadily in volume. Through the rising shriek of the wind, Catherine heard another sound. Horses. She looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with a sudden, sickening dread. He had heard it too. He put a finger to his lips, gesturing for her and Nijoni to move to the back of the cabin, away from the door. He took the rifle from its pegs on the wall, his movements economical and deadly calm. 4 riders materialized out of the first thick swirling clouds of red dust. They were not the drunken cowboys from before. These were different men, their faces hard and lean, their eyes holding the cold, flat look of predators. They carried their weapons with a casual familiarity that spoke of a life lived by the gun, and leading them, his face a grotesque mask of triumphant hatred, was Elias Buchanan. He had not come back with the law. He had come back with bounty hunters. They reined in before the cabin, their horses shifting nervously in the face of the growing storm. Blackwater Buchanan's voice was a raw shout. "Nearly torn away by the wind? I have come to finish our business. I told you this world had no place for you, or your little tramp." Thomas remained silent inside the cabin, a shadow in the dim light. He would not be baited. Buchanan laughed, a crazed, unhinged sound. "No matter. I have a new business proposition, a bounty, $500 for the scalp of a horse thief. My associates here are very eager to collect." The wind howled, whipping sand into a stinging, horizontal spray. Visibility was dropping with every passing second. The world outside the cabin was becoming a roaring, red chaos. Suddenly, one of the bounty hunters spurred his horse forward, not toward the door, but around the side of the cabin. Thomas cursed under his breath. The back wall had no window, no way to see. Before he could react, there was a splintering crash as the man used the butt of his rifle to smash through the wooden shutter Catherine had just barred. A hand reached through, fumbling for the crossbar. "Stay with Najoni," Thomas commanded, his voice a low growl. He moved toward the back wall, but it was a diversion, as his attention was focused on the broken shutter. The cabin door was kicked open with a violent crash. Buchanan and another hunter stood there, their pistols drawn. Their forms distorted silhouettes against the swirling red maelstrom outside. Thomas spun around, bringing his rifle to bear, but it was too late. The hunter with Buchanan fired, his shot going wide in the dim light, splintering the log wall just inches from Thomas's head. In the ensuing confusion, as Thomas dove for cover, the first bounty hunter, having finally unbarred the shutter, scrambled through the window. He did not go for Thomas. He lunged for Catherine. She screamed, a raw cry of terror, as his arm, strong as an iron band, wrapped around her waist, dragging her back toward the window. "Leave her!" Thomas roared, rising from his crouched position. But Buchanan and the other hunter were laying down a suppressing fire, their bullets thudding into the cabin walls, forcing him back. "Get the girl, we will take her. Let him watch." Buchanan shrieked over the storm, his eyes wild with a mad glee. Catherine fought, kicking and scratching, but the man was too strong. He hauled her through the broken window and threw her onto the ground outside. The storm hit her with the force of a physical blow. The air was a thick, choking cloud of sand that filled her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. She could not see. She could not breathe. She felt herself being dragged, then lifted and thrown across the front of a saddle. A rope was quickly lashed around her, binding her to the rider. Through the deafening roar of the wind, she heard Thomas cry her name. It was a sound of pure agony, a sound that would haunt her forever. Then she heard another sound, the thunder of hooves, as Buchanan and his men spurred their horses and disappeared into the red blindness of the storm, taking her with them. Thomas was trapped. He could not pursue them and leave Najoni alone and unprotected. He scooped his terrified, weeping daughter into his arms, holding her tight, whispering to her in their own language. He carried her to the sheltered alcove where the old Hogan stood, a place the storm could not fully reach. He settled her inside, wrapping her in blankets. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice raw with an urgency that transcended language. "Do not move from this spot." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, a desperate, final gesture, before turning and running back into the storm. He burst from the relative calm of the alcove into a world of pure, elemental fury. The sun was gone, blotted out by a sky turned to blood and dust. The wind was a solid wall, trying to push him back, to scour him from the face of the earth. But Thomas was a part of this land. Its fury was in his own blood. He found his horse, its eyes wide with terror, and swung into the saddle. He had no trail to follow, no tracks to read. There was only the wind and the red darkness, but he knew where they would go. There was a pass at the far end of the canyon, a treacherous route that led out onto the open plains. It was their only way out. He rode into the heart of the storm, It was like riding into hell. Sand and gravel tore at his face, stinging his eyes until they were raw. The world was a screaming, sightless void. He bent low over the horse's neck, trusting the animal's instincts, trusting his own deep, cellular knowledge of every rock and twist of this canyon. He was not a man anymore. He was a hunter, a wraith of vengeance moving through a world unmade. He found the first one by sound, a horse's terrified whinny. Too close. Thomas slid from his own mount, a knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He moved forward on silent feet, a ghost in the swirling dust. The bounty hunter was trying to control his panicked horse. He never saw Thomas coming. There was a muffled cry, a brief struggle, and then silence. One was down. He continued on foot, his senses stretched to their breaking point. He was an animal, tasting the air, listening to the shrieks of the wind for any sound that was not natural. He caught a fleeting glimpse of another rider through a momentary thinning of the dust. The man was dismounted, trying to get his bearings. Thomas threw his knife. It spun end over end, an arc of deadly steel, and found its mark in the man's back. 2. Now there was only Buchanan and the man who held Catherine. He could hear Buchanan's voice, a thin, crazed shouting, trying to keep his last man moving forward. They were near the mouth of a narrow arroyo, a deep, dry wash carved by 1,000 flash floods. Thomas circled around, using a high ledge for cover. He saw them below. 2 horses, 2 men, and Catherine, a slumped, bound figure. The man holding her was trying to urge his horse down into the relative shelter of the arroyo. Buchanan was on foot, his horse having thrown him. Thomas raised his rifle. He had 1 shot, maybe 2, before the wind and dust would make aiming impossible again. He had to make it count. He could not risk hitting Catherine. He sighted on the man holding her. He breathed out, and the world narrowed to the space between the rifle sight and his target. He fired. The man cried out, his body jerking, and he released his hold on Catherine. She tumbled from the horse, landing in a heap on the sandy floor of the wash. Before Thomas could fire again, Buchanan saw him. With a scream of pure rage, he dove for Catherine, dragging her to her feet. Holding his pistol to her head, he used her as a shield, backing away down the arroyo. "It is over!" Blackwater Buchanan shrieked, his voice cracking with madness. You lose everything!" Thomas scrambled down the embankment, his own pistol now in his hand. He faced Buchanan across 20 yards of swirling sand. It was the final standoff. But something else was happening. A low, deep rumble was building, a vibration that came up from the soles of his feet. It was a sound that was not the wind. It was the sound of 1,000,000 tons of water, a flash flood born from the storm's deluge in the high country. And it was coming down this arroyo at terrifying speed. Buchanan, lost in his hatred, did not notice. His entire world was Thomas. I should have killed you when I had the chance. I should have. The ground shook. The roar was deafening now. Thomas screamed a warning. Buchanan, the flood. Buchanan turned his head, his eyes widening in confusion, and then in absolute terror, as he saw the wall of brown, churning water and debris that was thundering down the wash toward them. It was the land itself, rising up in its fury. In that last, fatal moment of hesitation, his grip on Catherine loosened. Thomas lunged, grabbing her, pulling her, scrambling with all his strength up the steep, muddy side of the arroyo. He felt the spray of the water on his heels as they clawed their way to the top. They collapsed on the ledge above, soaked and gasping for breath, and looked down. The arroyo was a raging, unstoppable river. Elias Buchanan was gone, his last, terrified scream swallowed by the roar of the flood. He had been erased, scoured from the earth by the very storm that he had hoped to use as his weapon. The peak of the storm passed. The wind began to lose its impossible force. The thick red curtain of dust began to thin. Thomas pulled Catherine close, holding her as if he would never let her go. His entire body was trembling, not from the cold, but from the violent, shuddering aftermath of the terror of losing her. He buried his face in her wet hair, his hands running over her back, her arms, assuring himself that she was real, that she was whole. He held her there for a long time as the sky slowly lightened and the world began to re-emerge from the chaos. He was shaking, this strong, silent man who had faced down death without a tremor. He finally pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his eyes raw with an unbearable love and relief. His voice was a broken whisper. "No one dared to help you that day," he said, his words a raw, ragged testament to the journey they had taken. "But you made everyone change." She looked at him, at the man who had become her world, and knew it was true. She had not just found a home in this hard, beautiful land. She had helped to make it one. The scars left by the storm and the violence slowly faded, absorbed by the patient, healing power of the land itself. Time in the canyon did not march in a straight line. It flowed like the seasons, a repeating cycle of growth, stillness, and renewal. Winter came, dusting the high mesas with a brilliant white powder and driving the family into the warm, firelit heart of their cabin. Spring followed, bringing a riot of improbable wildflowers that painted the desert floor in brief. Glorious splashes of purple and gold, the small world Thomas and Catherine had built, born from kindness and forged in conflict, put down deep and lasting roots beside the trickling stream. The cabin became something more than a home. Its location, in a sheltered canyon just off a lesser-known trade route, made it a natural stopping point. Travelers, caught by a sudden storm or having lost their way in the maze of rock and sand, would sometimes stumble upon it. A prospector with a lame horse, a family of settlers whose wagon had a broken axle, even a young Navajo man on a journey to visit a distant clan. Catherine and Thomas turned no one away. They would see the familiar look of fear and exhaustion in the stranger's eyes, the same look Catherine herself had worn, and they would offer what they had: a warm fire, a simple meal, a safe place to rest. The home that had been built to be a sanctuary for themselves became a sanctuary for others. It became a small point of light in the vast, indifferent wilderness, a place where a lost soul could find their bearings again. Catherine, in ladling stew for a weary traveler, saw the reflection of her own salvation. The news of their stand against Buchanan and of Thomas's final act of mercy had spread through the territory. It became a quiet legend, a story told around campfires. The new marshal, who was eventually assigned to the region, a pragmatic man with a sense of the land's unwritten laws, made a point of never venturing into their canyon. An unspoken treaty had been established. The world of Canyon Dieli and the world of Thomas Blackwater's family had found a way to exist, separate but no longer at war. As the cottonwood tree by the stream began to shed its golden leaves, heralding another autumn, the community decided it was time. Their promise to each other, made by the firelight, was a bond of the heart, but there needed to be a formal recognition, a ceremony to weave their union officially into the life of the people. It was not a wedding of white lace and solemn vows spoken in a church. It was a gathering of family under the vast, open sky, the scent of pinon smoke sweetening the crisp air. They stood before the door of their cabin, the home they had built with their own hands. Desba was there, and her husband, and the man whose life Catherine had inadvertently saved, his arm now healed. Elders from their clan, men and women with faces that held the wisdom of generations, came and sat on blankets spread on the ground. Desba, acting as both aunt and elder, stood before them. She spoke not of law or religion, but of balance. She spoke of the man who had lost his wife and found a new partner to walk the path of life beside him. She spoke of the woman who had come from the east, a stranger with a wounded spirit, who had shown the courage of a warrior and the heart of a mother. She spoke in the Dine language, her words a beautiful, flowing river of sound. And though Catherine could not understand every word, she understood the meaning perfectly. She was being welcomed, not as an outsider who was being tolerated, but as a cherished part of the whole. Thomas placed a simple silver band, one he had hammered and polished himself, onto Catherine's finger. It was cool and solid. She, in turn, placed a ring woven from sweetgrass, a symbol of the earth and the home they had built upon it, onto his. There was no kiss in that moment, only a long, profound look between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had survived, of the life they now shared. And then the community celebrated, not with raucous noise, but with food, with stories, with the steady, joyful beat of a drum that echoed the beating of their own hearts. That night, after the last of the guests had departed and the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Catherine sat on the small porch with Nijoni, the girl, no longer a small child, but growing tall and thoughtful, leaned her head against Catherine's shoulder. The moon was a fat, silver coin in the sky, illuminating the canyon with a soft, magical light. "Mother," Nijoni said, her voice quiet, "Desba told me again tonight about the day you came." Catherine smiled, her hand coming up to touch the smooth wooden turtle that always rested at her throat. She looked out at the peaceful, moonlit landscape, so different from the harsh, sun-baked world she had first encountered. "Do you remember it?" Catherine asked softly. "I remember the dust," Nijoni said, "and the loud men. I was afraid, but you looked more afraid than I was." Catherine's smile became wistful. She pulled the girl a little closer, the familiar weight a comfort against her side. I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life. It felt like the whole world was a big, empty place, and I was all alone in it." "Why did you not run away?" "Because I had nowhere left to run to," Catherine said, her voice thick with memory. "And because something happened, something very small, but very important. I was kneeling in the street. You see, and I thought my life was over. All the men were laughing, and all the other people were just watching. No one dared to help me." She paused, turning to look into the girl's wide, dark eyes, the same eyes that had looked at her with such solemn bravery on that terrible day, until a very brave little Navajo girl, with eyes as bright as obsidian, came and stood right in front of those mean men. She was trembling, but she stood tall, and she whispered, "My father will keep you safe." Nijoni looked down, a shy smile touching her lips as she remembered her own small act of courage. "And he did," she said. Catherine's gaze drifted to the cabin door, where she could see Thomas's silhouette as he moved about inside, banking the fire for the night. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a love so deep it was a quiet ache in her chest. "Yes, he did. You both did. You saved me that day. Nijoni." They stood together on the small porch of their cabin as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. A new day, a new beginning, one of many they had been granted. The air was cold and pure, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant pine. Thomas came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist, pulling her against his solid warmth. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a familiar, comforting gesture that had become the anchor of her world. The sun crested the mesa, and its golden light spilled across the canyon, setting the red rocks on fire and chasing the last of the purple shadows from the valley floor. It was a beauty that still, after all this time, took her breath away. It was the beauty of survival, of strength, of a peace that had been hard won. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. She was no longer Catherine Harlow, the widow running from a haunted past. She was Catherine Blackwater, a wife, a mother, a woman who had found her own strength in the heart of the desert. "This west," Thomas said, his voice a low rumble beside her, his gaze fixed on the magnificent sunrise. "It does not need perfect people, only those brave enough to be kind." Thank you for being part of our journey today. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And remember to subscribe to Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.